Alrighty, good morning, kids. This is day 3 of our DBQ essay. On day 1, we went over the context and thesis, and the video for that is right here. On day 2, we went over the body paragraphs and writing it and structuring it, and that is in this video right here. And today we're going to go over conclusion and how to try to get that unicorn point with whatever time we have left to spare on writing our DBQ. The reason we go after the unicorn point last in our conclusion is because we don't know if we're going to even have time to finish our essay, because again, we only get 55 minutes, really only 40 minutes after you configure planning. So we want to get as many points as we can as possible, the fastest, which is those first 6, before we go for that last extremely hard point to get that lesson point, and then 0.1% of kids get. So that's why we're saving it for last. So again, if you want to review how we wrote it so far, go back to those videos. Students today are coming in with their context or thesis written in all 2 of their body paragraphs. Their thesis and body paragraphs can be set up as continuity and change. It could be set up as different significant impacts, right? That you think that each body paragraph could kind of paraphrase and summarize. Maybe you see 2 big ideas or 2 major impacts that you could paraphrase through the evidence. You could set up your document that, or your DBQ, that way, or you could set up your essay with maybe like positive impacts and then negative impacts, right? So those are all the 3 different ways that you could really set up your DBQ essay and your body paragraphs with your thesis. So that was up to today. So let's open up our how to DBQ. This is also in your resources. And this is pretty much all review that we went over. And again, it's 25% of your grade. You're only going to get so much amount of time to do it. 15 minutes to do your prep, which is those steps to writing the DBQ. If we go back to those steps, that is this handout right here. Again, we start off by reading the prompt. We want to read it twice. And when we read the prompt, we want to identify the skill, the content, the time, and the place or region, really. And then after we identify those 3 things, we're going to bullet point everything we know about those subjects, okay? After we bullet point everything and we know about that content and the time period, we're going to annotate and try to group basically the information or main ideas or evidence that we could take from the documents and can we apply them to our argument based on the skill in our prompt. That's what we're going to be looking for when we analyze those documents. So again, with the skill that we identify in our prompt, we are going to be making a T-chart of the different arguments we can make from that skill, whether it's cause and effect, continuity and change, or they're asking us to compare and contrast. Okay, we want to identify that right away so we can make a T-chart, putting our continuity and changes or our cause and effect or our 2 comparisons. Okay, we're going to annotate them, analyze them, write the main ideas, write our HAP idea that we could do. The easiest thing for the HAP would be what's sketchy and reliability, because your HAP statement, your sourcing statement, is going to go over the reliability of the document that you use as evidence. So you might want to just jot that down in the margins as well. After you figure out the different arguments you can make based off the skill, the prompt, and the content, and also by looking at how to structure your DBQ handout that I've given you, looking through the different frames based on the skill. After looking at all those things and having an idea of how you're going to set up your essay, and you kind of understand the 2 arguments you're going to make, you're going to start writing your context and your thesis. You're going to start working that out. That whole process of going through those documents, working out your context and your thesis, according to our DBQ steps, should take about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Okay. And remember, to help us write our context, we're going to try to figure out the time period we're in, and then just remember the big main ideas that went on that time period, and then try to narrow those ideas down to closer to what the idea of our thesis is. Okay. An example of that yesterday was if it's a prompts on the Mongols, you don't want to bring up what's going on in the Americas, right? That's, even if it's in the same time period, that's way too broad. We want to narrow that context, that background information, and set the stage with specific information that relates to our thesis. Now, let's go over our final closing paragraph. Now, the closing paragraph, there's only one point that you could really earn in it, and that is your unicorn point. Otherwise, you don't really need a closing paragraph. A closing paragraph, you can get, it's for just specifically the unicorn point. And you can get it in multiple type of ways. It's so many different ways, okay? I know teachers that give the unicorn point for students just writing beautifully, having great sentence syntax, not having any spelling errors, just writing like a professional, really. I know teachers that give the unicorn point for that. I know teachers who give the unicorn point for expanding upon a different skill that the prompt doesn't ask for. So, for example, if your whole thesis is about the impacts, okay, and just the impacts, in your closing paragraph, you might bring up the continuities, the way it didn't significantly impact the content you're speaking about. In our Africa DBQ, we're talking about the diffusion of Islam, right? So if you did continuity and changes, you wouldn't have to do it. You couldn't do impacts because you already have an essay dedicated to impacts, which again are the changes. What you would do then is compare and contrast. How did Islam affect Africa, but then how did it affect Southeast Asia? Or how did it affect South Asia? Or how did it affect Spain and Europe? Right? So you would compare and contrast it to another region if you did the continuity and change setup of the essay. But again, you bring in another skill and you basically analyze it there. Um, what else? What else? What else? You could bring up a counterpoint in your closing paragraph. And that's established with the counterpoint thesis at the beginning. If you use the unicorn thesis in your last paragraph, you're going to bring up that counterpoint and elaborate on the counterpoint and bring up why people might believe the opposite of the argument you're making. And then you're going to disprove that argument. You're going to say why it doesn't make sense. Um, Now that's the hardest one to do for me. The easiest one is just to bring up a different skill or a different piece of content with the same skill, like a different region. It's completely up to you. Those are just the different ways that you could achieve getting that unicorn point. So if you do get to your closing paragraph with the time left on your DBQ, you're going to start off and just re-summarize the context that you gave in your opening paragraph, and that's just in like 1 to 2 sentences. And you're going to restate your thesis that you gave in the last sentence of your paragraph. So basically, the first couple sentences in your closing paragraph is just you rewriting stuff in your intro, and then from there, you're going to give your unicorn point. What happens next? What's the significance? What's a different skill? So if you're doing continuity and change, how can you compare the continuity and change in that region to another region? If you're doing just effects or cause and effects, how can you talk about, if you just did effects or just impacts, you can then talk about what caused those impacts and effects with the Islam, how that spread. You could go even further back in the content for your closing paragraph. You could just write really well. You could write professionally, have beautiful sentence syntax, no spelling errors, set up the paragraphs the way it's supposed to be set up, and write a real argumentative essay. Those are all different ways you can get that unicorn point. All right, so let's look at a unicorn point in the last body paragraph. Here is just an extension of the example prompt we've been going over since the beginning of these videos. And this one, again, is just on evaluate the extent in which the Mongols impacted Afro-Eurasian societies during 1200 to 1450. If you want to see what this student wrote for their topics or for their introduction paragraph and their body paragraphs, you can just go back on the DBQ resources. Just go look at the slide and you could go through them. So here's an example of the unicorn point with that prompt. She opens it up with the same context she has in her introduction paragraph. Genghis Khan united the Mongols and helped them to widely expand their empire. They were skilled horsemen and were experts with the bow and arrow, which gave them great advantage in battle and allowed them to conquer areas across Afro-Eurasia. Now here is the link sentence, not a link sentence, her thesis, the exact thesis from her last sentence in her introduction paragraph. The Mongols significantly impacted Afro-Eurasia society positively by diffusing different cultures and increasing the exchange of goods, and negatively through violent conquest. Now here comes her unicorn point. Notice the color codes. It's that ACE format, the answer, the cite, the explain, and then the answer, the cite, the explain. Okay. It looks like I messed up some of the colors here, but I'll fix it after. But we'll go over. Okay. Now, again, in this instance, this student brings in the continuities in for the unicorn point, because the essay was all about the impacts. So that impacts are also changes, right? So Afro-Eurasia, so the Muslims, she talked about the positive impacts and the negative impacts. We see that in her thesis here. So she's going to bring up the continuities, the things that the Mongols really didn't impact. Okay. So let's see how she introduces it. She says, there was also many traditions and cultures in Afro-Eurasia that were around before the Mongol invasion. It continued on past the Yuan dynasty's collapse. Notice that she specifically said continued. That lets the reader know that, hey, she's bringing in a different skill that's going to get her the unicorn point. This is her example. This is her cite, a fact. For example, some of the leaders of the Mongolian Khanates adopted Islamic traditions due to the region their province reached. After the collapse of the Mongol Khanate, Islam continued in the region. That should be your green right there. It's orange right now. Let's change it to green on the slideshow. My bad. But yeah, so you're red and then you're green. Your cite and then you're explain there. Now she's going to bring in another example. She says another example of a continuity is sea-based trade. Sea-based trade was affluent in the Indian Ocean before and after the collapse of the Mongolian Empire. Great job. Okay. Now she's going to tie it back to her thesis, because she's basically giving continuities, which is kind of against of what she's arguing in this entire essay. So she's just going to tie it back to her thesis again and say, even though the continuities are important to recognize, it does not disprove the Mongols significantly impacted Afro-Eurasian societies positively by diffusing different cultures and increasing the exchange of goods, and negatively through violent conquest. That's a mouthful right there, right? But yeah, just restating her thesis and saying, yeah, even though there are continuities, my argument still is better, right? So yeah, that's a unicorn point. Try to write it. Good luck. Not many kids do it. You got to have perfect writing. You got to have great spelling. You got to have your essay set up properly, and you got to be able to bring in another skill or region or content within your unicorn point. I wasn't talking to you, Siri. Bye, kids.